Welcome to the Behind Story, where the wildest Karen encounters come to life. Get ready for jaw-dropping, hilarious, and downright unbelievable moments as Karens take entitlement to the next level. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a crazy story. Let's jump right in. Jake Mitchell had always believed in one simple principle: live and let live. His farm wasn't just land. It was history, a living testament to generations of hard work, resilience, and the kind of quiet dignity that only those who work the soil truly understand. Every morning, he woke to the golden glow of his fields stretching beyond the horizon, the crisp scent of damp earth filling his lungs, and the rhythmic sounds of his animals greeting the dawn. This was his sanctuary, his home, and he had no intention of letting anyone take that away from him. But trouble had a name, and its name was Karen Whitmore. Karen wasn't just any suburban busybody. She was the self-appointed queen of Crestwood Estates, the pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood that had sprung up a few years ago on the outskirts of town. Where Jake saw rolling hills and freedom, Karen saw a problem, one that didn't fit into her carefully curated vision of a perfect community. To her, Jake's farm was a blemish on the otherwise uniform landscape of meticulously mowed lawns and soulless white fences. The first time Karen appeared at Jake's property, she carried herself with the air of someone who had never been told no in her life. Dressed in an immaculate beige pantsuit, clipboard clutched like a weapon, she strode up his gravel driveway as if she owned it. Jake, rocking lazily in his chair on the front porch, sipped his coffee and watched her approach with mild amusement. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike, like a realtor about to sell him his own land. Jake took a slow sip, savoring the moment. "That's me. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your property." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know my farm was part of Crestwood Estates." Karen's smile was thin, forced. "Technically, it's not, but as I'm sure you understand, property values are a delicate matter. Your farm presents some concerns." Jake set his mug down. "That so?" She launched into a litany of complaints. The red barn was an eyesore. The animals were disruptive. The very existence of an unpaved driveway was an aesthetic issue. With every word, her irritation grew, as if she couldn't believe she had to explain this to a mere farmer. Jake listened, expression unreadable. Then, with a smirk, he leaned back in his chair and drawled, "Let me get this straight. You want me to repaint my barn and tell my rooster to keep it down because your neighbors don't like the sound of the countryside?" Karen's eyes flashed. "Mr. Mitchell, I'd hate for this to become complicated." Jake stretched, taking his time. "Well, Miss Whitmore, my farm isn't part of your HOA, and last I checked, my barn, my animals, and my land aren't hurting anyone." Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV, the tension hanging thick in the air. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with storms before, but something told him that this one was going to be different. The battle began in earnest just days after Karen's first visit. It started small, an official-looking letter tucked neatly into Jake's mailbox, stamped with the Crestwood Estates HOA logo in bold, self-important lettering. He didn't even bother opening it right away. It sat on his kitchen table for a full day before curiosity got the best of him. When he finally unfolded it, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. A formal request for compliance. A list of so-called violations his farm was committing. The red barn was a visual nuisance. The rooster was creating noise pollution. The livestock, his goats, cows, and chickens, were not in alignment with community standards. And the kicker? A demand that he remedy these infractions within 7 days or face further action. Jake let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me." Instead of responding, he pinned the letter to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow and went about his day. But Karen wasn't the type to take silence as an answer. A week later, she returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Flanked by two other HOA board members, one a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, the other a woman with the permanent scowl of someone who hadn't enjoyed a single day in her life. Karen marched up his driveway with the authority of a queen descending upon a peasant's land. Jake, wiping his hands on a rag from fixing the fence, sighed as he saw them coming. Mr. Mitchell, Karen greeted him with an exaggerated sigh, as if this was all so exhausting for her. "We need to talk." Again, Jake crossed his arms. "Do we?" Karen ignored his sarcasm, thrusting a thick packet of papers into his hands. "You failed to comply with our requests." As per HOA regulations, Jake let out a short laugh. "Lady, I'm not in your HOA. Your regulations don't mean a damn thing to me." The man with the glasses cleared his throat. "We have been in contact with county officials regarding certain zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation of specific ordinances, you may be subject to fines." Jake's amusement faded slightly. He knew his farm was in full compliance with agricultural zoning, but he also knew people like Karen didn't stop until they found anything to make his life miserable. He took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "You go ahead and do what you have to do, but if I catch you or anyone from your HOA stepping foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing." For the first time, Karen's expression faltered. Just a flicker, gone as quickly as it came, but Jake saw it. He saw the frustration tightening her jaw, the realization that she was up against someone who wasn't going to fold. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," she muttered. "No," Jake corrected. "I think you are." With that, he turned his back on them and walked away, leaving them standing there, seething. That should have been the end of it. But Jake knew better. Karen wasn't done, and neither was he. The first real sign that Karen was done, playing by the rules, came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Jake had just finished his second cup of coffee, preparing for another day of hard work, when he stepped outside and saw it. A fence. Not just any fence, an ugly, towering steel monstrosity, the color of dull concrete, slicing through the edge of his property like an open wound. He blinked, trying to process the sheer audacity of what he was looking at. Then he spotted the workers, power tools in hand, cutting into his land like they had every right in the world to be there. And standing among them, clipboard in hand, was Karen. Jake felt the slow burn of anger creep up his spine as he strode toward them. The workers noticed him first, their movements hesitant, uneasy. They weren't Crestwood HOA members. They were just hired labor, doing a job. But they knew enough to recognize when trouble was brewing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake's voice was low, steady. The kind of voice that, despite its calmness, carried weight. The kind that made people stop what they were doing and listen. Karen, however, turned with that infuriatingly polite, smug expression, the one that barely masked the condescension behind her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell," she said, feigning surprise. "I didn't expect to see you so early. We're simply implementing some community improvements." Jake glanced at the fence, then back at her. "On my land?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if he were being unreasonable. "There's been some confusion regarding the property lines. We reviewed older survey maps, and we believe the original borders were drawn incorrectly. Given the circumstances, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust accordingly." Jake let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists. "You believe?" She gave a tight-lipped smile. "Yes, and until we get official clarification, we're proceeding." Jake turned his attention to the workers. "You boys got a permit for this?" One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, hesitated. "HOA told us they had all the legal permissions." Jake smirked. "They don't. And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, you're trespassing. Which means I'll be calling the sheriff." That did it. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. They weren't about to risk legal trouble for an overzealous HOA. One by one, they started packing up, muttering under their breaths. Karen's smile cracked for the first time, her frustration barely contained as she turned to Jake. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. "This is a community decision." Jake pulled out his phone and, in full view of everyone, started dialing. "Then let's make it official. I'm sure the county would love to sort this out." Karen paled. "There's no need for that," she said, stiffly, her voice losing some of its edge. "Then you'd best tell your people to pack it up," Jake said, amusement creeping into his tone, "before they end up in handcuffs." With a murderous glare, Karen turned on her heel and barked an order at the workers. Within minutes, the fence project was dead in the water, the crew loading up their trucks and leaving without another word. Jake stood there, arms crossed, watching as Karen stormed back to her SUV, seething. He'd won this round. But he knew Karen wasn't done, and he was right. Because the next morning, a massive "for sale" sign was planted at the edge of his property. Jake stood there, staring at the sign like it was some kind of sick joke. Under negotiation, coming soon, an expansion of Crestwood Estates. Karen had gone from petty complaints to outright land theft. Jake didn't even hesitate. He marched over to the sign, ripped it straight out of the ground, and tossed it onto the back of his truck like a sack of feed. Then, before he could even call the HOA, Karen showed up, her SUV kicking up dust as she pulled into his driveway with all the subtlety of a storm on the horizon. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she called, stepping out of the car with a sickeningly sweet smile. "I see you've noticed the sign. There's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure." Jake folded his arms. "You're telling me a real estate agency just mistakenly put a "for sale" sign on my land?" Karen's smile didn't falter, but there was a glint of desperation in her eyes. "Some realtors were a little overenthusiastic about our community expansion efforts. Simple mistake." Jake let the silence stretch, let her feel it. Then, finally, he spoke. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put this sign up and tell them to never step foot on my property again. Because if I see another one, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing the entire HOA for fraud." Karen stiffened. "Mr. Mitchell, let's not be hasty." Jake pulled out his phone. "I can also get the county involved, if you'd like." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with a sharp inhale, she turned and stalked back to her car, without another word. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. She wasn't backing down, but neither was he. Jake wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make sure Karen regretted every step she took against him. The first thing he did was get ahead of her games. He drove down to the county records office and pulled every single document related to his farm deeds, zoning approvals, land use permits, every piece of legal paperwork that cemented his rights. He made copies and kept them on hand, ready to shove legal proof in Karen's face the next time she tried anything underhanded. Then he went on the offensive. Jake had been friends with Sheriff Tom Caldwell for years. Tom had already been dealing with the string of bogus complaints Karen had filed against the farm, but when Jake laid out the full scope of what she was trying to pull, the sheriff let out a long, frustrated sigh. "You're telling me she tried putting up a fence on your land, slapped a "for sale" sign on it, and now she's still pushing?" Tom asked, shaking his head. "Yep," Jake said, "and I have proof." Tom rubbed his temples. "All right. You let me know if she steps even a toe out of line again. Next time she or her people trespass, I'll make sure they get the message loud and clear." With that backup secured, Jake turned his attention to something a little more satisfying: petty revenge. Karen had complained about his rooster? Fine. He bought 3 more, every morning at 5:00 a.m. Sharp. The chorus of crowing carried straight into Crestwood Estates, loud, obnoxious, and completely legal. It wasn't long before Jake started receiving new complaints, anonymous letters stuffed into his mailbox, all written in the same aggressive, passive-aggressive style Karen had perfected. Your farm smell is making our property values plummet. Please be considerate of your neighbors. The sight of farm animals is distressing to young children. Consider fencing them off from public view. A well-kept lawn is a sign of respect. Mow the fields or expect further action. Jake was genuinely impressed by the sheer pettiness on display. But he wasn't done. Next, he took Karen's aesthetic concerns and turned them into a spectacle. If she thought his fields were an eyesore before, she was going to love this. He planted an entire row of sunflowers along the property line, towering, golden beacons of defiance. Now, instead of a simple farm, Crestwood Estates had a vibrant, living wall of bright yellow blooms blocking their pristine view. Then came the real fun. Jake had a friend, Mason, who ran the local farmers market. Over a few beers one night, an idea was born. Why not host a weekly farm event? Mason suggested, grinning. Make it legal, make it loud, and best of all, make it something they can't touch. Jake loved the idea. He put up flyers around town. Farmers Fun Day, free entry, come meet the animals, enjoy fresh produce, and support local farmers. The first weekend, it was a hit. Dozens of families showed up, kids running around petting goats, adults buying fresh eggs and milk, local musicians playing live country music. It was everything Karen despised: community, noise, and people having fun right next to her perfect neighborhood. As expected, she showed up, livid. "This is completely unacceptable," she screeched, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "You can't just turn your farm into a public spectacle." Jake leaned against the fence, grinning. "Oh, but I can. I checked county laws, and my property is fully zoned for agritourism." Karen's eye twitched. "But the noise, the parking, all legal. County approved, and people love it." Jake gestured to the happy families around them. "In fact, I'm thinking of making it a weekly thing, maybe even expanding it." Karen opened and closed her mouth, looking as if she might actually explode. With nothing left to argue, she stomped away, muttering about bringing this up with the board. Jake only smiled. He wasn't just winning. He was enjoying every second of it. But Karen? She wasn't done. And she was about to make a mistake so big, there'd be no coming back from it. The cracks in Karen's reign of terror started small, barely noticeable at first. But the thing about people like her, they never know when to stop. The final straw came when she tried to block off the roads leading to Jake's farm. One crisp morning, Jake stepped onto his porch with his usual cup of coffee and nearly dropped it when he saw them brand new, freshly planted, no trespassing, and private community signs lining the public roads leading to his land. Crestwood Estates had actually tried to claim a public road as their own. Jake stood there for a moment, just taking it in, before shaking his head with a low chuckle. She's getting desperate. He didn't bother arguing with Karen this time. No, this was beyond her now. Within an hour, he was on the phone with a county official, explaining the situation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. By noon, a county inspector arrived, looking every bit as pissed off as Jake had hoped. Turns out, Crestwood Estates had absolutely no legal right to claim the roads. In fact, the county had already been annoyed with Karen due to the sheer volume of baseless complaints she had filed against Jake's farm. Within hours, every single sign was torn down, and Karen, she received a formal warning from the county for attempting to interfere with public roads. That was strike 3. By now, the HOA board was fed up. They held an emergency meeting that night, and for the first time, Karen was outnumbered. Jake got a text from Linda, his unexpected ally from Crestwood. "It's happening. They're voting to remove her as president." Jake simply grinned and took another sip of coffee. A few hours later, Linda sent another message. "She's out. It's over." Karen had lost, and worse, she had lost publicly. The very people she had lorded over for years, the same homeowners she had fined. harassed, and controlled, were now the ones throwing her out. The next morning, her house was up for sale. The rumor around town was that she wasn't just leaving Crestwood Estates, she was leaving the entire town. But Jake wasn't done delivering justice. That same afternoon, he had a new sign made. A big one. Welcome to Mitchell Farms, no HOA, no Karens, no problem. He planted it right at the edge of his property, facing Crestwood Estates. It became a local landmark overnight. People drove by just to take pictures. Even the local diner got in on the fun, renaming one of their menu items the Karen Special a plain, dry chicken sandwich with a side of unsalted fries. For the first time in years, Crestwood Estates was free. Yards that had once been meticulously micromanaged by Karen's absurd rules were now filled with personality. Kids could finally ride their bikes without fear of being reported. Neighbors actually started talking to each other, relieved to be out from under her thumb. And then came the final, delicious twist of karma. A few weeks later, word spread that Karen had moved into another HOA-run neighborhood in a different town. But this time, she wasn't the enforcer. No, she had unknowingly placed herself under the rule of an HOA president, even worse than she had been. Within a month, she was drowning in the same nitpicky fines she had once delighted in handing out. Her grass was half an inch too high. She got ticketed for parking too close to the curb. And the best part? The new HOA president hated troublemakers. The second Karen tried to assert herself, demanding a leadership role. She was shut down so fast it made her head spin. By the time Jake heard about it, Karen's house was already back on the market. Poetic justice at its finest. Meanwhile, Jake's farm thrived without HOA interference. He expanded his farmer's market, and it became one of the town's biggest attractions. Families came from all over to enjoy fresh produce, live music, and good food. Even some of the former HOA members became regulars, happily buying eggs and vegetables from the very farm Karen had tried to destroy. Jake never saw Karen again, but every now and then, when he sat on his porch drinking his coffee, he'd glance at the sign by his property line, the one reminding the world that Mitchell Farms was a Karen-free zone, and he'd smile. Because in the end, karma had done exactly what it was supposed to. Karen's downfall wasn't just a moment, it was a slow, spectacular collapse that everyone in town enjoyed watching unfold. After she was officially removed from her HOA throne, she tried to fight back, of course. She threatened legal action, but without the HOA backing her, she had no power. The homeowners she once bullied didn't fear her anymore. In fact, many of them openly celebrated her removal. Some even started breaking the very rules she had enforced, planting wildflowers instead of the dull, uniform shrubs she had mandated, repainting their front doors in bright, non-regulation colors, and hosting backyard barbecues that went well past her old, ridiculous curfew. Karen was done, and she knew it. Her house went up for sale within a week, and just like that, she disappeared. Jake expected that to be the last he'd hear of her, but karma wasn't finished yet. A few months later, word started trickling in from another town, a place not too far from Crestwood Estates. Karen had moved into another HOA-run neighborhood, thinking she could claw her way back into power. What she hadn't realized, though, was that this HOA already had a ruler, someone even worse than she had been. Within weeks, Karen found herself drowning in the very same nonsense she had once inflicted on others. She was fined for minor infractions. Her trash can was an inch too far from the curb. Her holiday decorations weren't aesthetically cohesive, and her driveway had an unauthorized oil stain. And when she tried to assert herself, thinking she could push her way into leadership, she was shut down immediately. The HOA board didn't just reject her, they humiliated her, making it clear she wasn't welcome in their little kingdom. By the time Jake heard the news, Karen's new house was already back on the market. She had lasted less than 6 months before being forced out again. Jake couldn't help but chuckle when he heard about it. Meanwhile, his farm was thriving. His weekly market had grown into a full-blown community event. drawing in families from all over. Even some of the former HOA members from Crestwood Estates had become regulars, happily buying fresh eggs and produce from the man they once tried to fight. Jake never saw Karen again, but every time he looked at the bold, defiant sign at the edge of his property, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms. No hoe, no Karens, no problem," he'd take a slow sip of coffee, lean back in his chair, and smile. Because, in the end, karma always gets it right.